Oh, it's a sweet treat for you guys today. In the pantheon of perishable delicacies that have played keystone roles in shaping our cultures and our world, no one can deny the lofty position of cacao. From its birthplace in the Amazon basin, Theobroma cacao captivated ancient civilizations like the Mocoya and Olmec peoples of Central America and Mexico, where over 4,000 years ago, cacao was being used by pre-Columbian cultures like the Mayans in both their spiritual and daily lives. The Aztecs took ceremonial use of cacao to another level entirely, believing that cacao was gifted to them by the gods and was used as currency more valuable than pure gold. According to one resource on cacao that I found, Montezuma II was said to have consumed multiple gallons of chocolate daily for his lust and energy. The Spanish explorers and monks, who too fell under the spell of this magic bean, brought it to Europe, where its legend continued in the West, becoming a favorite drink of the royal houses of both France and England. And in England, the birth of the chocolate house mirrored that of coffee houses and gentlemen's clubs, becoming public spaces for the discussion of news, politics, and general gossip. It was, in fact, in one of the most famous of these houses that the crypto-Jacobites plotted the downfall of King George while sipping chocolate. Being a treasured symbol of the aristocracy, we find chocolate turning up in the cultural commentary of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. In A Tale of Two Cities, a French aristocrat and one of the great lords at court enjoys an elaborate morning ritual with chocolate, with 4 lavishly liveried servants engaged in conveying the precious chocolate to Monseigneur's august lips. Well, for your lust and energy, and not to be outdone by Dickens, today we are speaking to chocolate royalty. My guest is Jerry Toth of Toth Chocolate, a luxury chocolate brand. Jerry studied economics at Cornell University and was a Hansard scholar at the London School of Economics. After very briefly working as an investment banker, he switched gears and relocated to South America in his 20s, and then nomadically roamed the continent for several years, working as a foreign correspondent first for Adbusters magazine and taking other odd jobs. But during that time, he witnessed an era of unrestrained economic growth and ecological decline in Latin America, and he ultimately set out on a mission to demonstrate what sustainable economic development can look like in real life. In 2007, Jerry laid roots in the Pacific Forest of Ecuador, where he co-founded a rainforest conservation organization called TMA, and created multiple rainforest preserves, became a food forest farmer, resurrected an ancient cacao variety from the brink of extinction, and launched this luxury chocolate company called Toth, and is now building a regenerative cacao growers association across a 100,000-acre conservation corridor. Jerry's work has been featured in hundreds of media outlets across 6 continents, including National Geographic, Forbes, Vice, Smithsonian Magazine, and Modern Farmer, among others. You may have read one of the articles about the most expensive chocolate in the world. Jerry has also written and directed 2 experimental films, including Kissing Gaia, which is about the psychedelic cactus of San Pedro, and The Life and Death of Gaia, which explores the long-term trajectory of life on our planet in the aftermath of digital intelligence. Dude, it's like deep. He is also the director of the International Avant-Garde Film Awards in New York City. And I did mean that. I wasn't being facetious. We'll get into some of Jerry's many talents, but you are going to find him to be a Renaissance man, a Jerry of all trades, if you will. So thanks for hanging in through that lengthy introduction. Let's get into my interview with Jerry after these words from Jesse.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. Today's episode is also brought to you by ASAP, Appalachian Sustainable Agriculture Project. ASAP, Appalachian Sustainable Agriculture Project, will offer the Business of Farming Conference on Saturday, February 22nd in Asheville, North Carolina. This annual conference brings together professional and aspiring farmers from across the Southeast to network and share resources to build viable farm businesses. Scholarships for BIPOC and limited resource farmers are available, as well as discounts for farm partners registering together. Registration opens in mid-November. Find out more at asapconnections.org. That's asapconnections.org. All right, enjoy the show.
I'm not in Ecuador. I'm actually in Barbados right now, which is where my partner lives. I will be in Ecuador in a few days, but it would have been tough to record a podcast from the reserve because our Wi-Fi is patchy satellite Wi-Fi, and there's lots of just bird and insect sounds, which sounds nice in theory, but it can get loud. And so this is a better place to do this for me.
Yeah. I had the great fortune to interview Miguel Altieri from Colombia, and we we had to start over so many times just because the connection failed, and then there was a storm, and then the wildlife sounds were so intense. It really makes you appreciate the biodiversity and how different it can be down in the rainforest areas. So, Jerry, you are someone I've been very interested in speaking with because we have somewhat parallel lives and parallel products. It's one of those agricultural products that fits into a category of sort of everybody's highest echelon of what we think are, kind of luxury category goods, but also where the quality of the agricultural product is how we measure our worth in the marketplace. And so speaking with you, it's going to be a real treat, I think, for everyone. So if you wouldn't mind, would you introduce yourself first? Tell us about you and your story and how you've come to be working with cacao.
Sure. I originally in college, I actually studied economics, so I did not study anything closely related to what I'm doing now. And my very first job after graduating was actually working on Wall Street in New York, which lasted for about a year. And then I quit and just kind of abruptly relocated to South America and kind of changed everything in my life. And I've basically been, for the most part, been living in the tropics ever since. It was kind of a pretty sharp turn. And I started in that process. I lived in many different countries doing many different things, a lot of odd jobs. I started writing for a magazine called Adbusters magazine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that magazine. It's kind of like I guess you could say it's a very progressive anti-consumerist magazine that really looks at different approaches to economic systems, agricultural systems, and that brought me in connection with permaculture. And at the time, I was starting. This was right before the 2008 economic recession, and the economy, especially in South America, was just cranking. But everywhere that I went, everywhere that I looked, you could just see ecological decline. It was shameless. It was everywhere. It was unapologetic. It was just what was happening. And so at the time, I just identified that as the single biggest threat that I thought was facing our civilization, our species, and at the individual and community level, then at the national level. And so I linked up with two other, I guess you could say, like-minded idealists at the time. One was an Ecuadorian woman named Isabel Davila, The other was an American ecologist named Brian Criswell. This is in about 2007. And we started a conservation project in Ecuador. That was our mission. And we didn't fully know where that would take us and how that would look. All we knew is that we wanted to be practitioners of permaculture, and we wanted to protect the forest that was kind of in the crosshairs of agricultural expansion. And with that kind of as our very vague idea, this organization grew up, the Forest Preserve grew up, and now it's become a much larger project. And so we raised $16,000 in cash from friends and family, and we purchased a property at the very top of a mountain, kind of an otherwise abandoned property, at the top of this forested mountain that was, for the most part, surrounded by deforested land, primarily cattle pasture, slash and burn corn. And we just kind of set up camp there. And slowly but surely, we went about building a forest preserve in the existing parts of the forest. And then in the lower parts where the land had already been cleared, we started, practicing regenerative agroforestry and permaculture to the best of our knowledge at the time, the best of our ability, because we weren't, we had taken courses and everything, but we were still, we were learning almost fully on the fly. And in that process, we came across cacao trees as just a really useful forest restoration tool. It was something that our neighbors were growing, something that has thousands of years of history in Ecuador. And so we used it as kind of just a reforestation methodology. We integrated cacao with other trees, and I just got personally obsessed with it. Got really into the whole kind of the art and science of it. And as soon as those trees started producing fruit, we started making chocolate by hand in our lodge in the middle of the forest, which was totally off the grid and still is totally off the grid house. So everything was done by hand. Initially, it was roasting beans over an open fire in a cast iron pot, manually deshelling them, manually grinding them. It was very rustic, but the aroma of it was so incredible. It was the aroma alone was something that was so special. And so I was really developing this intimate relationship with cacao. And then I would periodically go back to the US to visit, friends and family. And I would just see, I would see people eating chocolate the way that I was raised to eat chocolate, which was that it's just simply, this is candy. This is something you get in your Halloween basket. It's just, this factory produced thing that's, brown has a lot of sugar and all these other things. And you eat it and you feel good for, while you're eating it, and then you kind of forget about it. And there's such a disconnect between that and what I knew the history of cacao to be, not only in Ecuador, but throughout kind of northern South America and into Mesoamerica. And so I saw this opportunity to create a business around elevating cacao to just a much higher level, and really looking at kind of the wine industry as a model for what I thought we could, for the way I thought we could make chocolate. And so that was kind of the basis of what became Toth. So I guess the organization, it was a nonprofit organization we started. It's called TMA, Third Millennium Alliance. That was in 2007. And then in 2013, I created the for-profit chocolate company called Toth Chocolate. And both are happily very alive and well today.
That's great, because it's not always the case. Can you talk a little bit about the history of cacao that people probably are not familiar with? And then also, you can do whichever one first, but tell us about the name Toth and what it means and how you chose it.
Yeah, so the cacao goes back at least 5,300 years. The earliest known use of cacao by humans was actually in Ecuador. And for many centuries, actually, it was believed by Europeans that it started in Mexico because Christopher Columbus and his boat was they were the first Europeans to encounter cacao, and they encountered it in Mexico. That story held literally until I think it was 2013, the year that we first started developing Toth, and archaeological evidence. And there had been kind of this belief and theory for a while among botanists and archaeologists that the origin of cacao was in Ecuador. And there was a really important archaeological discovery in southern Ecuador, close to the Peruvian border, that found not only kind of ancient sculptures or artifacts of cacao, of the cacao fruit, but also residues of cacao, of theobromine in pestle and mortar. And so that was 5,300 to 5,500 years ago. And as of today, that's the earliest that any humans used cacao. And so that's the history starting in Ecuador. And then from there, kind of the theory is that was just east of the Amazon. That cacao migrated across the east of the Andes, across the Andes through a pass into the Andes to this coastal Ecuadorian civilization called the Valdivia. From there, it probably traveled in balsa made rafts northward all the way up to Central America and Mexico. Which is why by the time the Europeans founded Mexico, it had already had a few thousands of years of history throughout much of that area. And so and in each of those places, it had a different history. Universally, it was considered this really special thing. It was, for all of its not just nutritional properties, but even its psychoactive properties. There's a lot of things going on in cacao, and people used it. Everyone from priests and the warrior class. Famously, it was used as currency in Aztec civilization, just cacao beans. And so
still in middle schools.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
And so, that's kind of, and then of course, Europeans discovered it, and there was a 100-year period where it's mostly just used by royalty and aristocrats. And then eventually in about the 1800s, it became the area of mass production began. I think it started in Germany. And cacao became something that was a bit more readily available. And, fast forward to, I wouldn't say fast forward today. I would say fast forward to about 20 years ago, before cacao, the peak of chocolate just being this mass produced thing that almost nobody spoke of as something special on the level of wine. I think there was a different shift that started to happen right around the time we started, about 10 or 15 years ago, where people started to give new appreciation to chocolate and to cacao. And that has been on the rise in the last 10 years, and that kind of continues growing. So it's case in point, there's a conversation, a podcast by a winemaker with a chocolate maker. It's kind of, this is where the history has led us up to this moment.
I find this also interesting because, I didn't really get interested in cacao as anything other than, the what you point to, how we come up with it as American children, is like this, I grew up in a family where, we didn't get candy all the time. And so Halloween was like our high holy day. And, kind of hoarding the good chocolates. And I remember, there was this huge part of my life where I didn't have chocolate for a really, really long time. And then I had really, really good dark chocolate for the first time, I think, in my late 20s. And it was kind of just an altogether different experience. I put it into a category like when you have your first wine that, for wine people kind of catches you and makes you look at it and look at everything in a completely new way. So what do you attribute that shift in to? Do you think it was this, I I say this not dismissively. I appreciate it. It's fun to make fun of as well, but like the hipsterization of everything, the bespokening. That's what I call the last decade. Is that what you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yes. I think there's different words you could use for that. Maybe it's kind of foodie culture is also a part of that. And I think you have, I mean, and I'm just thinking about this in the moment, I think we're at a position now in industrial societies where most people, there's no lack of stuff in our lives, where there's really, most people aren't struggling for survival. In fact, I think most people would say they probably have too much stuff in their lives. And so now you get to a point where it's not so much about meeting your basic needs. It's not even about proliferating the amount of stuff you have. It's actually about increasing the quality and the value of those things and appreciating it more. And then being able to tell your friends about this. It's kind of, there's a little bit of that as well. And I think that hit wine before it hit chocolate. I think there was a little bit of a lag time. But I think, wine paved I'd say wine and whiskey as well kind of paved that road for chocolate, and chocolate's just kind of coming up right behind. And now you have it in all other things too. You have it in, like, I've seen, bespoke water, mineral water. There's all sorts of things.
Yeah. Yep. Everything. Yes. No, we can bespoke it all. So the name Toth, tell us about the name.
So the name is kind of it's a play on the French term of terroir. This kind of, which you're clearly familiar with. And we wanted to kind of try to capture that in a way that was kind of congruent with Ecuador. And so my partner, co-founder Carl Schweitzer, did a really deep dive into different Ecuadorian dialects, ancient Ecuadorian dialects, and found this book that had, including some languages that are really no longer used, and tried to come up with a combination of words that spoke to that. And so we came up with we created a fusion of the words earth and tree in two different dialects. And so that's kind of the long-winded version of it.
The origin story. If you wouldn't mind, because I'm personally interested in this. So the cacao plant, what is it? Like a mid-story tree? Is it a big, tall, is it a dominant tree in the rainforest? How does it grow?
It's a mid-story tree. If left to its own devices in the tropical forest, it can grow 40 feet, maybe even taller. In plantations, it's, especially kind of monoculture industrialized plantations, it's probably just kept at something like 8 feet at most, if not, 7 or 8 feet, just for ease of harvesting. But in the forest, it grows in the understory. So it has evolved to grow in the understory of much taller trees. When I say 40 feet, I'm 40 feet in a forest where the canopy height's probably 100 feet.
Or several hundred, yeah.
And so that's the niche that it has evolved to fill. And for that same exact reason, that's kind of why conservationists are attracted to it. That's why we started using it in the first place, because you can combine it with other trees in an agroforestry setting and use it as a forest restoration tool in a way that, it's bringing income and revenue and or food for the people that plant it. But it's also creating this, it could also kind of slot into this forest ecosystem. So that's, I think, one of its most important characteristics, although there have been, there are people, and this is a bigger issue now, there are varieties that are adapted to grow in full sun. And so you now see increasingly cacao that's, just straight up monocultures of cacao planted in full sun, which is a departure from how that tree most likely has survived for thousands of years, and even spent much of the last century. For example, and I'm basing that on some of the farmers we work with who have been and whose families have been cultivating cacao for many generations. And their farms are, if you were to do a drone flyover to the untrained eye, it looks like you're just flying over a forest, but it's actually, it's a mixed agroforestry plantation with cacao and, 15, 20, 30 other species.
That's great, because I want to get into the system a little bit, because I think of that region and how a monoculture in that region, it stands out so much more than a monoculture of like corn in the Midwestern US does, just because of the diversity of that region. And so, in my mind, I can picture what I think of as like a palm plantation or a cacao plantation where, as you say, everything is kind of artificially short, grown in full sun, not anything else growing. And then you have this alternative system, which is how the plant evolved. And when we talk about, with these products, when we talk about terroir, this is what matters to me. I mean, this is what I think the whole conversation is about, because it's the other things that create terroir. It's not the one plant that we're growing. It's the way that it reads the other information that's coming into a very diverse system that makes something, climb up the tiers of interest. And so I would love it if you would speak about the farmers that you're working with, what those farms look like, what that represents in terms of the preservation of not only a way of life and sort of cultural relevance of the product, but also just how it makes the product so different.
Yeah. So, there's kind of, you can look at it in terms of, I would say there's two phases to this, at least in my experience. We started with Toth. We started out working with 13 very small scale farmers on properties, on, small farms where there had been cacao for, in many cases, over 120 years. And in some cases, there were cacao trees that were that age. So with that group, that was basically trying to not just keep those agroforestry parcels alive, keep them thriving, keep them productive. That was how I originally got into at least the chocolate side of this. What we're doing now with TMA, so TMA is the nonprofit that works with Toth. That TMA is kind of my original baby. We're actually using cacao to convert deforested land. So a lot of land that was either cattle pasture, slash and burn corn, was fallow land in between, slash and burns. And so we have developed this this system, or this consortium of plants, and we work with farmers to convert that to a very diverse agroforestry polyculture. And so, for example, we're using it's not necessarily a one size fits all approach, because every property is different. There's, you have hillsides are different. You have different, especially different microclimates here, where microclimates change really rapidly in short space of time. But generally speaking, it's 600 cacao trees per hectare, 600 cacao trees, 100 shade trees, so tall shade trees that are going to stand over those cacao trees across 15 different species. So those are kind of the anchors of the system, the pillars. Below that, you have a few strata. You have cacao as well as banana or plantain, which are banana and plantain are key staples in this area. And then in addition to that, on contour, sometimes we do things like lemongrass or citronella. And then in addition to that, so kind of at a minimum, we're planting with the farmers we work with, we plant about 20 species per hectare, but there's always a few other species of volunteer trees that happen to be on that property. So I think it's on average, there's about 30 different tree species in each of the farms we work with. And that's a little bit different from the earlier case of we look at it with basically two categories of growers: pre-existing cacao plantations, and then these new plantations that were previously mostly grass or maybe or corn, and now they're a more diverse ecosystem of productive plants combined with native species, native timber trees, but also other fruit trees.
Does that transition, do you start with the overstory trees and just practically, I'm thinking about that timeline and how you get people on board, what is that process like for you? And then, has that been challenging, to recruit people? And is that a lot about, does that play in a lot to the economics of this thing? Because I assume it's not cheap, to rebuild, and it takes time. You're working with trees, and especially there, if you're talking to overstory trees, that it's not a small endeavor. So can you talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah. And it took us many years to actually find the right recipe, so to speak, because for many years, we and other organizations, the idea of using cacao trees as an incentive to reforest land is not new. And yet it wasn't really happening. And we tried it for many years, and we'd say, hey, to our neighbors, listen, this is a great idea. We quantified what people were earning through cattle ranching. We kind of ran the economic student in me. We performed an opportunity cost analysis of all these other different land uses. How much are you earning per year per hectare with corn, with cattle, whether it's beef cattle, dairy cattle, all sorts of other different land uses. And we were able to point to the fact to say, listen, the farmers themselves would say, well, at current prices, it's just not, the cacao prices are too low. We said, all right, that's a legitimate obstacle. We can solve that, because one of Toth's claims, especially when Toth first started, was that it pays cacao growers the highest prices in the world. I've recently been told that there's someone in Hawaii paying higher prices, so I guess we can't say that anymore. But the idea was to pay a value that is in line with what we believe the quality to be. And so for many years, the cacao prices have gone absolutely bonkers in the last 6 months or so globally. But for many years, we were paying 3 times the market price of cacao for kind of our mid-range cacao. And then we were paying up to 8 times for the highest quality. And so that right there was a really strong incentive. People said, okay, yeah, at those prices, I'm interested. But there's another problem. I can't wait. It takes about 4 years for cacao trees to become productive and start producing, kind of very similar to wine, which I heard from one of your other podcasts. And so the point is, all right, what am I can't just wait 4 or 5 years I need money now. Like I need to pay. I got, several kids that I need to support. We need money for medicine, for food. And I still have cows in my land right now. That's value that I already have. Why am I going to make this, risky transition? And so we said, okay, that's fair. That is that's a second very legitimate obstacle. How do we overcome that? And that's where we integrated this concept of payment for ecosystem services. So that's a really potentially effective tool in the conservation and restoration world, where basically you are compensating whether the farmers, landowners, communities who are performing a service that has a net positive ecological benefit. Carbon offset markets, probably the most famous example of this. If someone plants trees, they are facilitating the ecosystem to pull carbon from the atmosphere and store it into biomass. That's a service, and the market's actually even ascribing a dollar value to that, so people can be paid according to that. I won't get into the carbon market because that's a very complicated, problematic other area. But we kind of took that as our model, and we said, all right, if the restoration of forest, especially in the ecosystem where we work, which is coastal Ecuador, that's historically one of the most deforested and threatened ecosystems in the tropics. The most important thing that needs to happen, not even just ecologically, but you could even say socially and ecologically for that region, is that we need to increase the forest cover along the mountains, especially where the water is born, kind of in the rivers that support everybody. And so there is undeniably an ecosystem service there if we can do that. Now, how do we quantify that? We did go through the exercise of quantifying that, of quantifying the carbon value of that. We're currently working with some groups to try to quantify the biodiversity value of that. But we, in kind of long story short, we determined that this is an ecosystem service. We, as this organization that's trying to, it's kind of serving as the midwife in this case, we are going to go out and find funders to channel funding to farmers that are willing to do this. And so our offer to the farmers was, we will pay you $4,500 per hectare over a 5-year period in monthly payments, kind of automatically debited to each person's account during this transition process. So we provide all the seedlings, all the equipment they need, fencing. We cover half the cost of irrigation. They cover the other half. We provide kind of like, we have communal electric weed trimmers for everyone in each community to use. Basically, everything that you need to do this, here it is. It's your job to actually perform this service. And in exchange, we will make these monthly payments. And those monthly payments were priced at a level that would exceed the opportunity cost of whatever else they were doing. And so the moment those plants go in the ground, they're getting paid. And so that was their way of saying, okay, all right, this is you. That is very important for us. Now we're actually making more money than we were making through cattle ranching or corn. And we know that at the end of this 5 years, when those payments end, our cacao trees will be productive. And then we have this really lucrative buyer. And now there's several chocolate companies that are buying it, who are ready to buy it. And so that's what really kind of flipped the switch in a lot of people's minds. And they said, all right, there's really no reason for us not to do this. This makes sense on a lot of levels. We're going to make that change. And so that's what, we started. I think the first year, and this was kind of this specific scheme grew up during the pandemic when there were a lot of food security issues. And so it wasn't just the cacao part was one element of food, kind of a larger food security program. So it was planting cacao trees in combination with banana and plantain, several other fruit trees, avocado, mango, citrus, breadfruit, jackfruit, and a few others that are kind of local to this area. And so the first year, I think it was the planting season of 2021, 10 farmers signed up, and we were all together kind of figuring this out. It was a success. The next year we added, I think, another 25 people. At this point, we're up to 85 families, and we have, I'd say 70% of funding to get us up to almost double that in the next few years. So it's starting to expand, and there's no shortage of farmers that want to take part. If anything, it's just, there's a shortage of our team that can, it's still something that takes a lot of legwork and work on the ground.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Ohio Earth Food. If you grow plants, you know that to a farm of any size, your soil is your most steadfast partner, an asset worthy of investing in. Since 1972, Ohio Earth Food has been the go-to source for the highest performing and most cost-effective granular and liquid fertilizers, seed starting soils, foliar sprays, and disease and insect controls, all approved for use on organic farms. They deliver them right to your farm, too. Don't count on luck this year. Start your seeds in their Plant Pro and the Seed Catapult potting soils, and put their ReVita fertilizers in your soil before you plant, and rest assured that your plants will have all the nutrients, stimulants, and energy for whatever comes their way. These natural blends utilize compost, kelp, and humate, and are low salt index safe for high tunnels. Feed your soils and let your soil feed the plants. Visit them at ohioearthfood.com, now with branches in Ohio and Wisconsin. ohioearthfood.com. All right, back to the show.
So you have TMA staff who helps with the transition, and there's training associated with that, I assume, and all that kind of thing. Okay. So it's incredible to me that you're able to raise the funding for, because let's just have an honest conversation about paying people for ecosystem services. It should work. It should be a great idea, especially since, the richest countries in the world are doing most of the damage. But in my experience, it's really hard to hold that up over time. So how do you attribute the durability of that? What's the special sauce?
Well, one of the benefits is that the ecosystem service payments aren't forever. They're not perpetual. They're for kind of a specific 5-year period. And so we went to just simply our network of sponsors and pitched this idea to people. And we were able to raise enough funding through them for the first phase. The project started working, was having a lot of success, and people loved the concept. And so then we were able to raise the next tranche of money through a larger, like a grant making foundation. And so I think people like the concept. I think that if you're right, if perpetual payment for ecosystem service payments is more challenging, people, 5 years is a little bit easier for people just to wrap their heads around. Who knows what the world is going to be like after 5 years in general. And so it worked. It worked at that level.
That's awesome. In most of these systems, once things kind of get to a certain point, are all of those crops being harvested by the landowner? And is it for like home use, or are they actually commercially selling the bananas and plantains and things like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The beauty, and even though we call this the regenerative cacao project, in reality, you could just as easily call it like the regenerative banana plus cacao plus plantain plus other project. Cacao gets kind of, top billing or whatever, but banana and plantain are very important. And so in those numbers I gave before, 600 cacao trees, 100 shade trees, something like in most cases, at least 300 plantain or banana plants per hectare. And those begin producing in the first year. And so that's the first tangible value that the growers get. By the end of the first year, they're actually harvesting plantain or banana. Most of that is consumed at either by people themselves or by their animals. So some of it's used for feed, not in big feedlots, but just like the pig out back. And the rest of it's used, by families. And that's always been, in this part of Ecuador, banana and plantain is so important. You go to any self-respecting home in the community where we work, people may not even have, no proper furniture. I've been in homes where the only furniture are hammocks and maybe 2 benches, but they will definitely have a big rack of bananas, home harvested bananas hanging there, or plantains. That's just a part of life. And that part had started to fade out. And, with greater access to supermarkets, we saw that that was being lost in the community where we work, and surely in many other communities. And a lot of the older people in communities were talking about that. And the reason that this kind of all came about in the pandemic is we realized that just the fragility of the global supply chain, and all of a sudden you had this community that was for many generations fairly self-sufficient in terms of food, slowly but surely losing that self-sufficiency. And then when the pandemic hit, you realize, wow, just imagine what would happen if those supply chain blockages were more severe. But you can get into some kind of really scary scenarios. And so that if you have a lot of banana and plantain on your farm, you're probably not going to starve. You need more than just that in a well-rounded diet. But in terms of a staple, it's really important. So people start growing that within the first year. The great thing about banana and plantain, again, especially banana, it's the way that it's grown here in Ecuador, kind of on a smaller scale, is that it is quite well adapted to the shade. So you can grow banana in these massive, full sun monocultures, but you can also grow them in the context of a forest ecosystem. And we in our forest preserve, when we go up into the uplands of it, and we still see there's these old relic agroforestry patches that haven't been managed that haven't been really inhabited or managed by people in over 30 years. And yet the banana is still kind of fully overgrown, but they're still there. And so banana and cacao, first of all, this is kind of getting into the whole permaculture philosophy of every element has to serve multiple functions. But banana is great because cacao trees, especially when young, need shade. Especially when the first 3 years of life, they need a lot of shade. The more shade you can give a cacao tree when it's young, the better chance it'll have of surviving and be healthy. And so even if you plant both of those plants at the same time, by the end of the first year, that banana plant will be hanging over the cacao tree and providing shade, especially direct, the strongest sun in the middle of the day. So that's an important part of it. And then, all the other elements, all the kind of play together. And of course, the shade trees are taking longer. The fruit trees are taking longer. Everything's on their, kind of on their own schedule. And the system is designed so that it's built to ideally, the best way to do cacao, if you have time and you're not in a rush, would be to plant nurse crops or banana plants a full year before the cacao trees go. And especially if you're going into a very degraded area. And we've done that with a few farmers that were in especially degraded areas. We've suggested to other farmers, but the mentality is just, hey, I don't want to wait one more year. Like I want that cash crop in as soon as possible. And so, there's other provisional, there's this spinach tree, it's called, which you can propagate here. That's the English word chaya in Spanish. And you can propagate it vegetably. You can slash a cutting of it, stick it in the ground, and it almost immediately grows up and produces foliage. And so we integrate that in year one, just to basically we're just trying to create provisional shade. And, as soon as that is no longer needed, it's extremely easy to chop and drop and start cycling in the soil. So that's a little bit of the chronology of it.
Interesting. And does it, I assume that once something has been converted to pasture or slash and burn, whatever it is, especially now, do you need to have irrigation to switch things over? I would think.
That's one of the interesting idiosyncrasies of the region where we work in. It's the Pacific Forest of Ecuador is what this ecosystem is called. And it's so crazy because it is on the mountain range where the forest preserve that we created is called the Hamacuaque Reserve. It's named after a pre-Columbian civilization called the Hamacuaque that inhabited this area up until the arrival of Europeans. That forest preserve is along this mountain range that reaches its peaks about 5 or 6 miles from the Pacific Ocean. And it's not an extremely tall mountain range. It's not the Andes. It's a coastal mountain range. It's, gets up to about in feet. I think it's, maybe 2,500 feet. At the very top of that mountain, though, it is a lush cloud forest. It is green and wet. It is ferns everywhere in the ground. The trunks are laden with moss and epiphytes. It is the greenest, wettest wonderland you can imagine. And yet, if you start walking downhill towards the ocean, in about literally 20 minutes, you leave the cloud forest and you get into a tropical evergreen forest or a moist forest. You keep going another 40 minutes, you get into semi-deciduous forest. You keep going another 20 or 30 minutes, and you're actually in a dry forest, a deciduous forest where the trees lose half their leaves for half the year. And then you get to the ocean. And so that whole thing is playing out on the side of this mountain. And so where farms are sited has a really big, really strongly influences the kind of water regime they have naturally and or they will need to add through irrigation. So there are some farms that are, and the other thing is we're not planting cacao trees and the top of the ridge tops of the mountains. That's just entirely native forest. And so there's no cultivation that goes on at the top in permaculture parlance. We'd call that a zone 5. The cacao plantations and I would say cacao forests are primarily sited in that mid elevational range where you get into degraded land, but it's degraded land that inherently wants to be a forest. It always has been a forest. And where a farm sits on that, it may not need any irrigation. I've been planting, I've planted about, I think it's 9 small parcels of cacao surrounding our house over the years. And, only 2 of them have irrigation. 7 don't. 7 just never needed it. And the 2 that don't need it anymore. We were just really babying them because they were kind of special ones. So you don't need cacao in a lot of cases. Some of the farmers that are a little bit lower on the slope, a little bit closer to the ocean, definitely do need it. And then you have a few that are kind of, could go either way. They may not need it, but there's going to be probably a little bit higher mortality rate in the first year. Those are farms where it would be much wiser to plant nurse crops in the first year, plant banana in the first year and wait. But for the most part, one of the big benefits that we are offering to the farmers we work with is irrigation access if they want it, because even if they don't necessarily need it, if you have irrigation, it will increase your productivity, obviously. And so the irrigation systems we set up are all just gravity fed from rivers, and it's a huge boon to productivity to the farmer. So not every farmer is using it, and with each year, you need it less and less. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and that's one of the big parts of site assessment when we go in and we're meeting with a farmer for the first time and we're walking his land. I do this with my kind of Danny Morillo is my right-hand man in this. And we go to every single parcel, we look at it, we walk it with the farmer, him or herself, and, look at the slope, look at what's growing on it already. And then the next question is always, all right, so what's your water situation? How dry does it get here in the end of the dry season? Is there, where is the nearest upstream, water source? And there have been a few cases where a farm has been otherwise, suitable, but lacked water access. And we just, there was just a feeling that we don't want to we want every farm to be successful, and we don't want to waste anyone's time. We don't want to waste our sponsors' money by planting a bunch of trees into an area where they're not going to have a lot of success. So in a few cases, we had to say, no, it's not suitable here. But for those farmers, we have a different kind of design, which combines balsa trees with banana and shade trees. And so you don't need irrigation for balsa trees, but you still get revenue in year 4 or 5. You still get food production starting in year 1. And then, down the line, you have avocados, you have jackfruit, you have native timber trees. So we try to find a little bit for everybody.
So with the balsa trees, is there a food product from that?
No. So balsa trees are also, they're actually native to Ecuador, to this, and they're a part of this native ecosystem. They're one of the most important pioneer species in our forest there. And so whenever you see a natural clearing, a
They
tree
come up
falls,
first.
you're probably going to see balsa trees start popping up, and they can grow to they can grow to 100 feet in about 8 years. It's crazy.
They're
Their growth rates
incredible.
are
Yeah.
absolutely insane, and so they're usually harvested at year 4 or 5. And it's a very soft wood. It's a wood that's so soft that even if like a 30-foot tree, you can cut it down with the machete with like just a few blows. But there's a market for it. As a kid, I remember using like that was the wood that was used for like toy airplanes. They're super light. There's in China has been importing them massively to use as part of wind turbines. And so it's kind of that's a whole other story because there was this well-intentioned law in China of promoting, renewable wind energy. And it triggered
Deforestation.
a lot of, yeah, just a really aggressive, harvesting campaign of balsa in Ecuador. It's still a bit of an issue, but
So it's primarily harvested for the fiber, basically for the wood.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
That makes
exactly.
more
No,
sense.
it has no structural value.
Yeah.
It's way too light.
I think we called it chicken wood because it's like, I mean, it's a crazy plant. I think it's amazing, and it does grow so fast. So I think about like the value in establishing a shade grown operation. Are you also trying to get some hardwood? Are there nut trees in the overstory? Do you just make that according to the site and stuff like that?
We have a suite of 15 species that are just the most reliable. We've been planting we've been reforesting land since pretty significantly since about 2008. We've probably tried over 50 different species, of which I'd say 30 are native species, and then 20 are exotic fruit trees that are familiar to most anyone. A few are probably fruit trees that may not be familiar to people outside of Ecuador, but we've just found the ones that work the best, the ones that are the most reliable. And so we generally speaking, we have about 10 native timber trees species that we always recommend. And then at least 5 tall fruit trees that we always recommend. Jackfruit grows amazingly here. Breadfruit grows amazingly. Avocado grows really well. Citrus can, but it's a little bit more finicky. But the real kind of like the stalwarts of the system are the native timber trees. And so we've also selected them so you have a few that are, if someone is going to harvest them for timber, and probably the children, or some cases maybe even the grandchildren of some of the farmers, there's different schedules of harvesting. So some are just have a 40-year, 50-year kind of cycle, but then there's others that are quicker, like 20 or 25 years. The hope being, like the goal being, just that these parcels are at no point ever there's clear cutting will never happen. There could be selective logging over the next few generations, but at all times there's going to be like a dynamic, diverse forest cover.
I get so distracted by the system, but let's talk more about cacao. What are the yields like in a shade grown cacao situation where it's growing in a polyculture? Do you evaluate that per plant? Is it per hectare? What does that look like?
Yeah. So they usually do it like kilos per hectare is kind of the common way. And in a traditional shade grown setting with varieties that haven't, just kind of old school varieties that haven't really been bred for productivity, it's kind of like 400 to 500 kilos per hectare. With really high yield varieties, you can get like 2,500, in some cases 3,000 kilos per hectare. But it's of a much lower quality. It's a variety called CCN 51, which is extremely productive, but the flavor is I've yet to taste a chocolate. I mean, no one uses it to make fine chocolate. You use it to, make cacao butter, maybe to make, separated and add the cocoa powder into some kind of mass produced product. It just doesn't have that. It doesn't have that flavor complexity that would be interesting as a chocolate bar, but it produces a lot. It's actually a really tricky thing to grapple with because it's so productive. But as a chocolate maker, I'm in this weird situation because I'm both a cacao farmer and a chocolate maker. And I remember when we were starting out at Toth, the variety that we're working with for the most part is this ancient variety called Nacional. It goes back thousands of years. It was believed to be extinct up until about 2009. There was one grove that was discovered in northern Peru, DNA tested. We found this other grove, and that's the cacao that we launched Toth with, and that we've been replicating and sharing with other farmers. It's famous for its flavor complexity. It's famous for its aroma. It's got really low yields. And so as a chocolate maker, I remember hearing farmers and this was our kind of the Toth party line at the time was, we won't work with any farmers that plant CCN 51. We only work with Nacional. But now that I'm a little bit more so on the side of farmers at this point, we're trying to we're trying to make this as successful as possible for farmers. It's hard to ignore those yield differences. But we still only work with Nacional cacao because in order for that program to work, you need the market, and no one will pay 3 times the price for CCN 51, no matter how beautiful the story is, just because it just won't make good chocolate. And so there's this interesting tension, and it's still, you hear it a lot in the chocolate industry. If you go to a chocolate conference, like CCN 51 is really vilified as this devil. But then you talk to most farmers and they see a CCN 51 plantation that's just pumping out fruit. And then right next to it is this Nacional plantation, which is, kind of meagerly producing. Everyone says, I want that. I want the thing that's producing a lot. So it's a tricky matter. And the only way to really solve that tension is if consumers or really the chocolate company is willing to pay cacao growers as much of a premium relative to the loss of yield they'll get. Otherwise, there's just no economic kind of reason for farmers to plant it, other than maybe there's maybe emotional one, but there's not an economic one. And so that's one of the reasons why we try to pay the highest prices, is to compensate for that. But it's still, there have been, some farmers they'll say, can I plant CCN 51 in this program? We say no, because we don't have the market for that. It has to be Nacional. And a few people have said, well, okay, I want to plant CCN 51. So I guess we're not going to work together. It's only happened, I think 2 out of the 80 farmers we work with, but it has happened.
Is there anything in between? I mean, is it Nacional or CCN 51 and there's nothing else? Are there no other cultivars?
Yeah, there is something in between. Ecuador has this agricultural institute. It's called INIAP is the acronym. And for the last 50 or 60 years, they've been doing their best to breed cultivars of Nacional that are higher yields, but still retain those flavor characteristics. And they've done a great job. And so there's a few cultivars that are really, they really do. This is Nacional cacao. Genetically, I've seen the DNA test. So it's, in a lot of cases, it'll be like 60% Nacional, and then it'll be, there'll be 8 other varieties in there that are the other 40%. Beautiful yellow pods, just like Nacional, really floral. The aromatics are really floral, maybe a little bit more, a touch more acidic in some cases than the true ancient Nacional, but really good. And the yields can be, there's not quite compete with CCM 51, but come close if all the conditions are right. If it's a well irrigated, well pruned, organically fertilized plantation, or if it's not organically fertilized plantation, I guess in the short term that would also do it. And so what we do with the farmers we work with is we provide, so part of it's the mix that we decided is we have a genetic bank of this ancient nacional variety. We identified the 9 trees that in this valley period plata that had their characteristics, we had them DNA tested through the Heirloom Cacao Preservation Fund. We identified, and they're all really old trees, like at the end of their lifespans, in a lot of cases over 100 years old. So we took graftings from each of those 9 mother trees and reproduced them in a protected area in the Hamaquaque Reserve. So we have 21 kind of clones of each of those 9 mother trees. And every year we take graftings from those clones and we distribute that to farmers as part of their cacao. But it's only about 15% of the cacao we provide them. The other 85% are these kind of nacional hybrids that INEAP has helped develop. And so every cacao, every farm has this. I mean, Ancient Nacional is like the holy grail of cacao. They all have the holy grail in their farm, but they also have the national hybrids that make them feel good because they see that they're producing pods and they have something to sell.
So with the propagation, can you do it vegetatively? Can you just take a stick and root it, or do you have to graft it onto like a rootstock?
You can take a stick and root it. It doesn't work very well. It's hard to do. I've tried it many times and I've had
very limited success
a few times.
Yeah.
But the main way is through grafting.
Okay.
And so that's, that's how most obviously any clone is going to be grafted. It's going to be a side graft. There's still a lot of own rooted cacao trees out there. By the way, thank you to you for that term, own rooted. I had never heard of that term. I've been looking for that term my whole life. And then I was listening to the other you on the No Tillers podcast, and you use that term. I'm like, own rooted. That is the term. So there's still a lot of own rooted trees out there. They have different, obviously, as you know, they have a different growth pattern. They have different, they start producing a little bit later. They grow taller, and they're not, true to seed, but they're also can be really special in their own right.
So are you also doing that? Are you going out and like trying to find the ones that have, either grown from seed or volunteered in place and trying to find the next nacional?
Yeah. So we have, and this is a system that Toth developed. We take so many of our cues from the wine industry, but we actually have a 3-tier system, we use the term cru. And so the Grand Cru is pure nacional, is ancient, is DNA verified, or trees that match all of the characteristics of pure nacional. So either a really, really old tree that has all the characteristics, or a tree that has been grafted from one of those trees that was DNA verified. So that's our Grand Cru. And then a first cru are the own rooted nacional trees that are, for the most part, they were probably planted in the mid 20th century, heirloom. In English, we just kind of use the term heirloom. It doesn't really translate well in Spanish, but so heirloom trees is first cru, and that has another price. And then the nacional hybrids we call second cru. It's that kind of gives a chance for every tier to have its own market. The second cru trees will be more productive. They get a little bit of a lower price. The Grand Cru is going to be the least productive and get, almost an exponentially higher price.
One of the cool things that I don't know, a lot of people probably don't know this because I didn't know it until fairly recently, but the fruit, the cacao fruit, is actually quite amazing. Does anybody do anything with that? Is that another product, or can you use that if you're also trying to use the other bits?
Yeah, it is. And so you can do the fruit is it's delightful, and that's probably how people ate cacao for a few thousands of years before the first genius realized that you could like roast the seeds and
Right.
grind it.
It's like
Whoever that person was, just like one of the MVPs of history. But
after the artichoke guy, whoever figured that out, it's like, I'm going to eat this whole.
Right. Well, then you get into the genius who figured out you can combine the ayahuasca vine with the DMT bearing plant. That guy or woman is just
right. It was definitely a lady.
We digress. The fruit is lovely, and that's also how we used to eat it in our first few years, because we didn't have a kitchen for a while, and so we would harvest it, one of those kind of feral trees in the forest, and open a pod when we were hungry or thirsty, and just you kind of goop out a bunch of those gooey seeds and put them in your mouth and just kind of suck the juice out and then spit the seeds out, and maybe the seeds become a tree. But there are companies that now are doing different things with the juice. It's hard to work with because the pulp is really it wraps around those seeds. We created one of the offshoots of Toth is a company called Shoka, which collects the drippings from the juice. So when the fermentation process, you collect all of those, like the freshly harvested seeds, you open the pods, you have those goopy, white, luscious, wet seeds. You put them into a big fermenting box for anywhere for 3 to 8 days, depending on what you're going for flavor-wise.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, so that's a really important part of the process. But all the while, like especially in day one, the juice drips from that. And so you have holes at the bottom of the fermenting box, and you have these drippings, and it starts to ferment quite quickly. So it's kind of like this really sweet. It starts out very sweet, and then it kind of gets like a tinge of like a wininess. And then after a while, it kind of veers into the vinegar. And for a long time, that was just treated as like an agricultural runoff. And it's really acidic. So it's not even like it's a little almost like an organic pollutant. It's so acidic, and people just let it run off into the fields and go into the river. It's probably not a very healthy thing, but it's this extremely useful, tasty thing. And so we started collecting it. And this is, we were taught by Servio Pachard, one of the other really important figures in the history of Toth, who's been doing this for generations. And he just the method is simple. You collect the juice really early on in the process, like kind of ideally the first 6 or 12 hours. And then you reduce it down. You just kind of put it on a double boiler and reduce it down. And you create this thick honey-like substance. And the thick honey-like substance has really high bricks. It's actually, if done right, it can be shelf stable for years. And so we started making a soda out of that. So mixing that with carbonated water and a little bit of, we have a ginger addition, with a cherry addition. So that was one thing that we did, and it's really good. Like it's like everyone who tries it, it tastes amazing. It's not the easiest thing to scale up. Other companies are doing different things with it. Some people are actually just like selling the juice, like kind of collecting the juice right off the bat, and immediately freezing it and then selling it. So there is opportunities. It's just a little bit. It's tricky. It's not like you can't just squeeze it the way you squeeze an orange. If you did, you may harm the seeds, and that's really kind of the more valuable part of the plant. So the goal is to get that juice without harming the seeds, and you got to do it really quickly.
Cool. Okay. So talk about the whole process. I mean, you just spoke about the fermentation part. So go through that. And then I also would love it if you would talk about the aging that you guys are doing, because I don't know a lot of people who are doing that. Carry on.
Yeah. So the process, as I said, you open up the pod, you scoop the seeds out, then you put them in, we put them in wood, like large 80 centimeter by 80 centimeter by 80 centimeter boxes or fermentation boxes. The first usually 48 hours anaerobic. And then you start, mixing it or stirring it or dumping it to lower kind of, there's like a stepped approach. You can dump it from one box to the other. And then you're kind of, then it's aerobic for the next few days. And different cacao varieties will prefer different lengths of fermentation. Once that process is done, if I would say the overall average is, probably 5 or 6 days, but you can go 3, and then you have a really, especially if it's with Nacional, if you do 3, it's, you're going to have a really aromatic cacao. Polyphenols are still fully loaded, but it could just be a bit too much, could be a bit too astringent. So that fermentation process really does, the chemical process inside the conversion into kind of alcohols in the bean helps modify some of the more bitter elements of it. So you kind of, that's your way of dialing down the bitterness so that the kind of the more subtle secondary flavors can kind of come to the fore. And that's there's a science behind that. There's also an art behind that, kind of choosing the right time. It varies depending on the season. If you've had a year with abundant water, your cacao is, may benefit from a shorter fermentation time because the flavors won't be as tightly condensed, concentrated. If you have in a year of a drought, you're going to have some really flavorful beans that may need a few more days, an extra day of fermentation. There's other ways during the production process to work with that as well. So once that's finished, you lay the beans out. At that point, it smells like wine. It smells like spilled wine on the floor. That's like the flavor note that I have, and I mean that in the like as a compliment. Yeah. And I love the smell.
Heavenly.
Yeah. And so you spread the beans out on a tray on these long tables on kind of over a mesh kind of bottom in something that looks like a greenhouse. And so for the next 2 weeks, you're exposing it slowly but surely to sun. You're drying out the beans. You're halting the fermentation process, drying out the beans. You dry it down to like 7% humidity. Moisture is what you kind of want to get the beans to. And then the next step is, then they're ready they have to be hand selected. So you have to go through by hand and remove malformed beans, maybe 2 beans that went through the whole process stuck together and therefore they didn't get a really uniform drying process. You remove those and sell those to like the local intermediary guy that's paying like crap prices. And then you take the good stuff and you convert that into chocolate. So the next step is roasting. So you roast it similar to the way you'd roast coffee. And then you kind of dehusk and winnow it, and then it goes through a grinding process. So you're just kind of breaking that down into like, you try to get it down to like 20 microns of particle size. So it's just so small that you can't even taste the particles. At that point, usually it's done at low heat, but enough for it's liquefied. And then if you're making just dark chocolate, you add the amount of sugar you'd like to add. If it's a 75% recipe, in our case, we usually, and historically didn't add things like extra cacao butter or any soy emulsifiers. So it's just, we're purists. We have one addition that has cacao butter, but for the most part, we just kind of want it to be old school. I don't know if you call it old school. Maybe it's new school. Yeah, but that's just kind of to be as pure to the bean as possible. And so you add, say, 75% bar would be, 25% cane sugar and 75% cacao solids. And that's all mixed together, integrated. And then the final stage of the process, where you have the ability to, influence flavors, the conching process. And the conching process is basically you have this cacao that's that's in liquid form. So, cacao liquefies at something like, 31 degrees Celsius. And so you can conch it at, a little bit over that, or some people conch it at higher temperatures, but just to, you are burning things off at the higher you go. So you try to keep it low. But it's liquid and you have these mechanical arms that are just kind of churning the cacao, the mixture at this point. It's called the liqueur. For anywhere from hours to even days. And what that's doing is that's expunging the volatile acids that are in the cacao. And so if you don't do that, you don't need to do that. One year recently, we did this really cool edition where we did same exact harvest. We did one edition that just wasn't conched at all, zero conch, and then another one that's conched at 18 hours, just so you can really perceive the differences. And if you don't conch it at all, you are getting kind of all of those flavor characteristics. You're maximizing aroma, but a lot of that acidity is going to be in there. It may be a bit more astringent, and so maybe aromatically it's glorious, but on the palate it may be maybe it may feel a bit green, like a young wine. If you keep conching it and you over conch and you like let it go for like some people, you could literally do it for like, let that thing conch for like 3 days. We've never sold the chocolate like that.
What's really going on? Is it exposure to oxygen? Like what's the process that's really happening in there?
I believe I believe that oxidation is part of it. I'm not a chemist, so I don't want to go beyond that because I don't want to say something that's.
But is it like a machine? Is it like turning it? What is it?
It's a mechanical machine that's open, and so it's like a depending on the size of what you're doing, either a small or a big drum. But you have this like mechanical arm, and so if you like put your head over it and you look into this big drum where this mixing is going on, you'll feel the acidity in your eyes. It'll hurt your eyes because it's expunging this acidity. So it's just kind of churning and churning. And if you can ruin cacao if you let it conch too long. If you let that happen for too much, you'll get rid of all of its personality and you'll end up getting just this kind of insipid, vapid kind of, chocolate that doesn't have any real life to it, but it's probably very approachable. So if you want to make some really easy, accessible bar of chocolate to someone who's, never had chocolate before, maybe that would be a good decision. But if you want to create a chocolate bar for someone who really loves chocolate and really loves getting into the flavor and complexity of it, that would be a shame. So you try to find that kind of happy medium between, you want to dial down a little that acidity just enough so that on the palate, it kind of unfurls in all of its beauty, but it still has a lot of that personality. And there's really interesting things too, like Nacional Cacao is famous for its floral aroma. That's kind of like its signature aroma. And so, we would have some years in Toth, we usually do one harvest per year. And so that harvest is what we are trying to express. And it's strongly influenced by flavor. If it's a El Nino year with a lot of rain, or if it's a drought year, there's different things that are going on. And so we kind of got into this rhythm over the years, of like saying, all right, maybe one year we really want to bring forward the floral aromatics. So we want to go easy on fermentation. We want to definitely go easy on conching. So we really want the floral aroma to kind of come out. And that will be that year. And if you're into that, that's great. But then sometimes those bars have, on the palate, there's going to be some notes of astringency that you're like, that's a little, I wish I could maybe dial that astringency down, like just a notch. And so then next year comes along and we'll remember that and say, okay, this year, let's go for more of a fruity flavor profile. And for a fruity flavor profile, you let the conch go a little bit longer. There's this interesting point where, at a certain point, the conching system kind of eats up the floral aroma, and then it leaves in its wake kind of this fruity aroma. And that's what we aim for. And if you go beyond that, then what you get is like just these kind of like caramely notes, you lose both the flower and the fruit. And so, and then the goal is to get both the flower and the fruit. You want those to be present in the bar.
Yeah, it must be like a microoxidation kind of a process. It sounds like under temperature that, I mean, you would have to be approaching it a lot like wine, where there's a sweet spot that you're going for, and a little too far or a little not far enough, and you're not getting there. That's really fascinating. So what's the deal with the aging? Because I know you're a vintage dater. So what do you? How long are you holding on to it? What do you notice? What do people need to know about that?
Yeah, so aging is another thing that we're looking. We look to the wine industry, but I think ultimately the model that we ended up kind of used as our guidepost was more the kind of the whiskey concept of barrel aging. And so a few things go on when you age chocolate. There is oxidation, and so that's gonna influence polyphenol content over time. The other thing it is, if you're just aging it with oxygen and no other aromas, you will get flavor transformation, but you miss out on this opportunity to extract other aromas from, say, barrels or other medium, because chocolate, or the cacao bean itself is, on average, like 50% of it is oil or fats. That's like the cacao butter, and then 50% is just like this, polyphenol packed solid. And the fats in the cacao bean, and so when you make chocolate, you still have that mixture. The fats are extremely absorptive of aromas. I mean, remarkably so, to the point where, if you want to do a test of this, and we say, whenever, like, on the packaging, when people buy our chocolate, we say, don't store this in a refrigerator or freezer. Just keep it out of sun, and ideally protected from other strong odors. Because if you put a piece, like an unwrapped bar of chocolate, in a refrigerator next to like a peeled onion, you're going to have like onion chocolate. So you don't want to do that. Please don't do that. But the flip side of that is, if you store chocolate in a cognac barrel for 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, and you're going to be slowly but surely, the fat in that chocolate's going to be extracting those aroma compounds. And then when it comes time to make the chocolate, you have this just beautiful, really special bar of chocolate. And so the process there is, we produce the chocolate. Rather than mold it into bars, we mold it into little chocolate coins. And then we import. So we've imported maybe 15 different barrels. We've also sourced some Ecuadorian barrels, and we've done a lot of aging in Ecuadorian wood, but all sorts of different barrels. We have the chocolate coins. If we're doing it in a barrel, we insert it into the bunghole, seal it up, and then usually just kind of try to rotate the chocolate. So you have this barrel full of chocolate coins. Try to rotate it every 2 weeks, so it just kind of, you're maximizing exposure of the chocolate to all the walls of the barrel. The barrels are empty, right? We're talking like an ex cognac, ex whiskey, or whatever it is. But there's still that, empty, but the walls of the barrel ideally are well impregnated with that. And so over time, it really absorbs it. In barrels, we've aged up to 6 years. In Ecuadorian wood, and just like last week, I tried one of our additions that we've been aging in Ecuadorian wood for 10 years. I would say the real sweet spot, the best additions that we've done, we've aged in a Lefroy whiskey barrel. We've aged in the cognac barrel was a great one. We aged in a Barbados rum barrel, Don Julio tequila. The Lefroy and the cognac ones stand out to me as the best, and they really kind of peaked at year. It takes at least a solid year for the chocolate to properly acquire the flavor, and then at that point, ideally a year and a half. And then it's kind of, especially with Lefroy, which, because it's so peaty, it was maybe a little bit quicker. Then it's probably ready to package and share. And that was good for up until about year 4. And then we started to notice that it started to just kind of lose a bit of that kind of that power. And so that's the process there.
Okay, well, I'm conscious that we've now been speaking for almost 90 minutes, and I have not even gotten to half the things I wanted to ask you about. But I would love it if you would just talk about your personal, kind of theory of change and how you feel this project is, part of your theory of change. Because I think for a lot of people, this is true. With wine as well, it's hard to talk about the relevance of something where we're getting paid, what's considered to be a very extreme premium on an agricultural product compared to somebody who's growing wheat or corn or cows or anything else almost. And it's a conversation that I take really seriously, because we do represent this category of value added, like the most highly value added agricultural product. And I think it's important to have an answer for, why we think that matters in terms of where we would like to see agriculture go writ large in the future. So I'm just going to give you a lot of space to talk about your view on those things and push back if you need to, because I think that's fair as well.
Yeah, I think this is something I think about a lot too. I think in general, after seeing kind of working so much, not just working so much with farmers, but also farming myself and seeing the amount of work that goes into it, and then often what you get paid for. Especially in a place like Ecuador, it's so hard to make a living at growing food. It's wine and chocolate make it a little bit easier because it's a special value added product, as you mentioned. Even with that, it's hard, but especially without that, it's damn near impossible. And when I look at projects we've tried to do in the past, and other organizations, other businesses that have tried to do sustainable farming successfully, it's much easier to find. Sustainable farming is easier to do than making money off it. That's the real problem. You can design the system.
That was probably the best quote ever. I just want to say that hands down. Thank you for saying that out loud somewhere in the world. I hope everybody hears that someday. Good job.
It is really hard. And so, like, as a land manager, I love sitting down and walking, or sitting down with a piece of paper and designing a planting scheme, or like kind of walking through a hillside. Like, what can we do here? But then the part of like converting that into a living for whoever's managing that land is so hard. In fact, I don't really know many successful regenerative agriculture projects, at least in Ecuador, where anyone is making a living. It's basically, you either have grant funding or some or like kind of independent wealth that can help you get through that. But I think long term, there has to be, the only way that sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture will work is if there's a way for people to make a living doing that. How do you do that? I don't know. I think one of the things is I in general, and I'll be the first to admit, when I go back to the US and if I go to Whole Foods, and when I get to the cash register, like, I swear into my breath when I see the prices. I'm like, no way, come on. I get angry, like everyone does. But I also know what's on the other side of that. And I do think that in general, so much of the things that we pay for, are actually worth more than what we're paying. And that applies to agriculture. That also applies to like the earbuds that we buy on Amazon. I think we're living this really strange, artificially enabled life where we have access to all these things, including we have food from all over the world. There's something in that is part of the problem. But then on the other side, if you just jacking up prices, like that's, then you start cutting off access, because then, and so that's another tricky part of it. I don't know what the trick is. I think there's maybe a new emphasis on kind of a de-emphasizing spending money on the crap in our lives, and emphasizing spending money on things that go to the core of just enjoyment, and even just health and food is part of that. So maybe part of that's just as a society, reallocating a little bit of how we spend money towards food. And that would allow, in theory, that's going to flow back to the people that are cultivating it. That can help. But I see that as an uphill battle, and I don't know how to make that happen on a large scale yet. I'd love to find that out.
Well, I do like to say that scale has become a conversation because people want it to be a conversation, but it's not an imperative to the conversation. And I see something in your operation that maybe you don't see yourself, which is, I think that there's a real beauty in any I like to call it the way that I like to think about wine, the way that I think about chocolate, the way I think about anything, coffee even, where it's such a luxury that we have access to it, that if we can support the people who are growing those things so beautifully, and that facilitates, especially the way that you guys are doing what you're doing, if that facilitates someone's capacity to grow food for themselves and feed their families in place on that same piece of land, while making some money that helps them stay connected to the world around them, and it's not a complete, homestead operation, which, by the way, amen, homesteaders, keep up with that. But that there's a way that it opens a door to an alternative system that is largely regional, where people are feeding themselves, but where we're enjoying something. It's like how back in the day, a couple hundred years ago, you only got, an orange was your birthday present. It was your Christmas present, because oranges only come from one place in the world, and it's like a super luxury. And that's what the world will move us in that direction, whatever else we think is going to happen. And I think that it's really amazing that what you're doing is allowing people to sort of subsidize the work that it takes to feed themselves, right? Because you're right. Nobody makes money. Nobody makes money, and land never promised to make people money. And so I think that when we can acknowledge that, but still have something really important to share with people, that's awesome. And so I'm really just so stoked that we got to have this conversation. But before you go, I want you to tell everyone your favorite way to enjoy your product.
Yes. So I enjoy a good glass of whiskey or cognac or what have you. I love pairing chocolate with whiskey or cognac or some aged tequila, whatever it is. Choose your favorite spirit. Not every spirit works. Wine, unfortunately, doesn't work as well as it could.
Whenever people put wine with chocolate, I'm like, what are you doing right now? But yeah,
it's very sad that I think somehow that got out, that, it sounds good on paper, wine and chocolate, but it doesn't work as well. But it works amazingly with certain spirits. And so the way I have this procedure for when I pair, there's it's almost down to the second. You can get really geeky about it if you want. But what I do is I will, I'll have, both things on the table. I'll have the chocolate I want to pair with, and I'll have the spirit. And I'll get to know each of them on their own. I'll taste the chocolate, let it melt, really fully kind of go on that flavor ride, sit with the finish. And then I'll move over to the spirit. I'll have a sip of that on its own, get to know it, explore it on the nose, explore it in the palate, the whole thing, as you would with a glass of wine. And then when it comes time to bring those two together, this is the procedure that I use. So I will put a piece of chocolate on my mouth, and I'll maybe use my back teeth to break it into like 2 or 3 pieces, but not chew. I'll just let it kind of sit there, and I'll kind of move it around. I'll let the melting process get underway. And specifically with Toth chocolate, I've found that it's like 10 seconds is like the moment. So you like after 10 seconds, takes about 10 seconds for that melting to really kind of begin properly. Then you take a little sip of the spirit and you give it like a 3-second little bath, and you swallow the spirit, and you hold the chocolate in your mouth. And then this really interesting flavor transformation happens like almost like a second afterwards. There's this blossoming of this other flavor that wasn't with either of those two on their own. It's like giving birth to this third flavor. And if you do it right, you find the right spirit, you find the right chocolate, and they marry well. That's the best, in my opinion.
You can make that stuff up. I believe that you have identified the ideal way to enjoy 2 extreme luxuries at the same time. Because anybody who's having a little pappy with their chocolate is really living an extreme moment. So I think that sounds beautiful. Jerry, thank you so much for your time today. Thank your partners for their contributions as well. And most of all, thank your farmers and the communities that support them, because I think that this has been just a real pleasure to find out about you guys. And I hope everyone will save their pennies and buy some Toth chocolate. And I hope to meet you in real life someday.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. This has been really fun to talk shop with another grower like this. And I've never done a podcast of this nature, so I really enjoyed it.
How many of you paused to get some chocolate to snack on while we were talking? I'm going to keep this brief because I did so many words in the intro, but always thank you for listening. Thank you to Jesse and Jackson and Dr. Professor for always providing a pleasant space for us to have these conversations. Thank you to the other awesome hosts of all the other Market Garden and associated no-till growers podcasts. Check all of them out. They are so great. And thank you, Dr. Professor, for editing out what will certainly be many places in this one that needed some editing. Take it easy, folks. Stay sweet.
All right. We hope you enjoyed that episode. Always make sure to check the links in the show notes for how to follow our guests and hosts. The No-Till Market Garden podcast is a free show that is supported by folks like you who contribute every month over at patreon.com/no-till growers. That support helps ensure all the shows we do, from the Seed Farmer podcast to the Winter Growers podcast, the Collaborative Farming podcast, the Composter podcast, Growers Daily, and of course, the No-Till Market Garden podcast, can continue to go and grow. You can also find books and hats, as well as an active forum over at no-tillgrowers.com. Huge thank you to editor Michael Sellis and producer Jackson Roulette for all their work on this show and the rest of the team over at no-tillgrowers.com. Otherwise, thank you all for listening, and make sure you are subscribed wherever you're hearing this so you don't miss the next episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. See you then.